community campaigns to stop toll roads, but I'll assure you there will be time for questions at the end. So bear with us and let us do it. Please give Scott a very, very warm welcome. Thank you for coming, Scott.
Thanks for still holding the invitation open.
It's lovely to have you here. We're going to have a chat. Excuse me for a minute while I sound like I'm awkwardly having a fake chat till I get in my zone, all right? I think the main thing why I was so keen, and Maureen touched on it, when Tony Abbott was the Prime Minister, he committed to backing federally 3 toll road projects, one in Victoria, one in WA and one in New South Wales. We now have a situation where the one in Victoria and the one in WA have been stopped. And we still face the reality that the massive 33-kilometre one sitting just outside our doorstep is still destroying our communities, and they are doing everything they can to make it go ahead. So I guess my first question to you, Scott, is we're feeling a little bit of despair about that. So can you tell us something about how it happened over in Perth that maybe would give us a bit of hope? And I guess give us a little bit of insight into what you think made it be able to stop there, and I guess then anything you know about what happened in Victoria as well.
Oh, a bit? Okay, thanks, Jenny. So I turned around to Lee, just being a brat, just being basically smug in the chamber, and said, so, we've knocked off Rail Highway and the Victorians have taken care of theirs, so how are you guys going with WestConnex?
You're right.
And she just looked at me with this look of horror in her eyes and said, actually, we're having a really hard time. Yeah. It's really quite a steep hill that we're climbing. And I immediately felt immensely guilty and said, just, if there's anything I can do to help.
I'm going to switch your mics.
I came here and did a quick tour around some of the impact areas, and so what I was going to share tonight really briefly was a little bit of what WA had in common and then maybe some of the important differences. New South Wales does political corruption in a way that nowhere else does. I get that, and it has done so since occupation. Like, it has done so since the very early history of the colony. So I get that there are some things different. In WA it's a lot more parochial. The kind of political and economic gene pool is a lot smaller, makes it a bit easier to map who's doing what to who. I know that it's really hard yards here. What we had in Perth, and the first thing I guess to say is that we took enormous inspiration from Victoria and from WestConnex campaigners here, but looking at how they made it work in Melbourne with the East-West link was really incredibly powerful, and we kind of learned a bit about, well, what's the overlay, what is similar, and again, what's our kind of unique context that we're going to need to think through. The things that I guess all three have in common are that they're driven and they're led by community organisers. It's a big, deep community grassroots campaign, and that's where the leadership comes from. It is not being led by politicians. With greatest respect to Jenny or to my colleagues at home, it's being led by people, not just those in the neighbourhood who this thing is going to obliterate their neighbourhood amenity, but from people right across town. The ones doing the work, and people who've been at this for years and years. I want to acknowledge them because, same, there are some familiar faces in here tonight. Persistence is 95% of winning these wretched things. So thank you very, very much for your persistence and for being here. But these campaigns create their own weather, right? And they draw people in from across the board. So we've got established environmental organisations, including people represented here tonight, leadership by traditional owners, by Aboriginal people whose commitment to country is of quite a different order to somebody who just might be really worried about the concrete getting poured over their back fence. And that's where the leadership comes from, and that's the backbone of these things. And I think it's the same as it ever was, like right from the beginning. Then the politics, also we have some things in common. We've got the government, Liberal national governments in all 3 states at the time, that have basically fused and have become functionally fused with the big engineering and the finance companies that are actually making the money. And between political donations, which Maureen mentioned, and really intensive overt and covert lobbying, and the fact that the same people drift from place to place. You have this fusion, and basically what it does is demobilises and contaminates your politics. Your democratic machinery, parts of your democratic machinery get shut down so that these things can proceed. And that feels very familiar. Again, a bit of a different magnitude here, but that feels really familiar. You've got a mediocre and compromised opposition. With all three of those projects, if you want to track back far enough, you'll find a Labor minister's signature on some of the project scoping documents. Like they're kind of a foot in and a foot out, which is what makes them so utterly frustrating. And they'll say two different things to two different audiences, expect us not to cross-reference what they're saying. It's a form of political gaslighting, and I am as sick of it as you are. But sometimes we just have to make that work for us. And then within formal parliamentary structures, you've got the Greens basically doing the hard work and had been there from the beginning. For Roe Highway, that was a part of the world, like a really beautiful wetland chain. The last thing that it needed was to be bisected by 4 to 6 lanes of of concrete for a toll freight highway. And I'd lived a significant portion of my 20s wandering around that wetland. So it was personal for a lot of people. Same as what's going on here. And the other thing, I guess, that is really similar is that we forget at the outset that this is being driven by traffic projections or any kind of rational or orderly way of planning a city. As Maureen said, that is bullshit. What happens is the decisions get made, and then the rationalizations and all the project documents and scoping, environmental impact assessments, all that process stuff, that all gets kind of back rationalized after the decision got made, after these agreements got made. That's what Tony Abbott said. We're going to have 3 freeways, Infrastructure Australia, you're going to pay for it. Go and do the cost-benefit analysis to show that it's a good idea. And that is the reason that they refuse to hand over so much of this stuff, because it's cooked. The documents are cooked, and that's why it's so hard to get audits done and that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And then that's the matchup. You've got, I scrolled out some notes because I did get a tiny little heads up and I'm about to finish. So what it's being driven by is not traffic projections of we're going to need a 50-lane freeway by 2030, so we'd better start making our traffic jams wider now. It's really not being driven by that kind of stuff. It's been driven by enormous blocks of money being transferred from taxpayers to private capital, private interests. And as I say, I think it's really important to note that your democratic machinery, which is hard fought for, gets kind of paralysed and kind of shut down in order to make that happen. And that's why the politics of it are always important. And that it's a pipeline, it's a process. WestConnex is not one thing, right? It generates a revenue stream, and then you can see these other hideous arms being welded onto the octopus. Oh, then we're going to do this, then we're going to do this. And you can kind of see 20 years of these atrocities rolling out in front of you, and they'll come up with another 20 years worth after that unless they're stopped. And then the whole idea of tolling, which we dodged that bullet in WA, and know it's got its hooks into this town and into Melbourne, creates that ongoing revenue stream, and they know how to write these contracts in a way that protect their interests after debacles like Cross City and stuff that happened in Brizzy. So that's the matchup. And as I say, 90%, 95% of that campaign is persistence. It's just having the courage to show up day after day after day, even on bad days. We don't know if we're going to win. You don't know. But you also don't know if you're going to lose. And that gap, that space of not knowing, is what is really motivating. You get through a rough 2 weeks. I've been reading a really beautiful book on this stuff called Hope in the Dark by Rebecca Solnit. She was an anti-nuclear weapons campaigner in the United States and just writes the most beautiful stuff on movement history, on telling our own stories, because God help us, the Daily Telly's not going to tell them for us. Our own movement history of the people who came before and the people who are up against it now, who do the work and have the wins. And often the wins are invisible. The wins are the absence of shitty things. That's the win. You get nothing. You get the absence of something. And it'll be like that with WestConnex when you win. Or the one after, or the one after that. But I strongly believe most of it is just showing up. Just turn up the next day, pass the word, and find the others. Find your allies and find your friends. That's how we got through. I could talk through a whole pile of there were legals, and we pushed it right into a state election, and we gave Labor the fight of its life, which is what our Victorian friends did. And you'll find some unique way of matching it up here, but sooner or later it's got to stop, because this beautiful old town being disfigured by dickheads with concrete trucks, and it's got to stop. Thanks.
I think that gives us a kind of big picture of where it's at. I'm really keen to hear a bit more about how you feel like that played out with the different tactics, because I think that's the thing where, if you look last night, we had this amazing 500 strong community action, where people made the most amazing lanterns and walked through the streets in the communities that were going to be impacted. We've seen people literally, and I acknowledge some of them are here, that have been arrested, taking direct action to try and stop people from destroying our neighbourhoods, and a big shout out and thank you for those people for putting themselves on the line. We've seen people trying to push up parliamentary inquiries, get debates in Parliament. We've had a whole lot of tactics, and I think what would be good, Scott, is to get a sense from you about how those tactics worked in WA. Like, there were legal actions, there were parliamentary inquiries, there was direct action. How'd they kind of play out a bit more on the ground?
All right, I'll give that a go. Can I just give a quick shout out to my dear friend and colleague Lee Rhiannon, who I think has just come up into the room, who has just got back from Palestine today.
Hey, you are here. Welcome.
Who else would do that, actually, fly back from Palestine and come to a WestConnex?
I did say, Lee, just have an afternoon off.
That's
she
so
doesn't
good.
do that. That's not her style.
Not really her style.
Welcome, Lee.
So in terms of tactics, the collective we, because it's not really orchestrated and directed in a formal way, but you've got people who are obviously aware of the different strands of it. Full court press, you throw absolutely everything at them. Everything up to and including the kitchen sink. And I saw some of the beautiful imagery from last night as well. And we had basically got civil society movements and neighbourhood organisers who aren't formally politically aligned, but obviously work really closely with the Greens. But it's important that they keep their identity separate from formal electoral politics. Sometimes it's actually really painful for us, but we understand why you've got to do it. It's fine. And I used to work in that kind of context as well. And then it's basically everything. So we had this really interesting template in Victoria where they pushed it. It was basically delays, just throwing sand into the gears. This is why you need legal people and enviroscientists to just jam up the EIS process as much as possible. Not by throwing vexatious stuff into it, by throwing some honesty and some ecological sense into the EIS process, and then that can spool things out. There's kind of formal avenues of appeal, and there's a whole pile of process stuff you can play with that is really about delaying. And what the Victorians managed to do so sweetly, and what we were able to pull off as well, is push it into the teeth of a state election. What Barnett tried to do, which is the reason they did such heartbreaking damage on the ground in Perth, was start the bulldozers months before they needed to. And that was why we ended up with non-violent direct action and people basically crossing fences and trying to shut down gear and get physically in the way.
If I can just jump in there, Scott, and say one of the things that we've been hearing more and more about what happened at Sydney Park is even the way that they felled the trees, not to mention the timing, because actually anyone that lives near there will see that they haven't actually done anything more to them now they've felled all those beautiful trees. They actually felled them, the way they cut them down, according to an arborist that works at the city, they actually cut them in the way that they do in rural and remote areas for maximum effect. So they just cut them at the trunk so that all of the activists and people sitting there would have to watch them fall. Whereas in the city, the standard way of doing it is to take them branch by branch, because that's actually the way they do it. So not only did we see them doing that months in advance or years in advance of when they needed to, but the visual impact was there attempting to crush what was the heart of the campaign.
Spot on. They did that to us. That's designed to break your spirit and break your hearts. You know they don't need to do it. And documents after the election show that they figured they were probably going to lose. It was just an act of pure bastardry, and I know that's being perpetrated here as well. So there was a pile of legal stuff. We actually, not we, but the movement in general, took a couple of really powerful activists who if you ever want to buy Kate Kelly an airfare across, or Kim Dravnik's, rather than hearing from politicians, you get that kind of bottom-up view, then well worth it, and I'm sure they'd love to come and lend a hand. So they threw a Supreme Court challenge underway, which was successful, and that blew everybody's minds. The Supreme Court said, hey, you EPA, you actually need to follow your policies. Now, I'm not a lawyer, but that was basically the ground on which the argument turned. Does the EPA need to follow its policies, or can it just recklessly disregard them? The Supreme Court said, well, no, hang on. You spent a lot of money and time developing the policy, you have to follow it, you have to respect it. The government then overturned that on appeal, but it lost them 6 or 8 months. And that pushed it right into the teeth of a state election, which is why they started construction. But at that point, if they'd started construction in 6 or 8 months prior, they'd have gone through us, and a pile of us would have got arrested, and that'd have broken a lot of people's hearts. And NVA can be quite traumatic for people right in the front line. Like, do it. It's so important, but also spend it wisely, because it's actually really hard on people. It's also kind of personally liberating and very exciting, but you don't want to be drawn into that kind of thing. You can't make that last for months and months and months. It's hard. But pushing it right into the teeth of the state election, and also shaming the shit out of Labor, is just to be able to say, come on, under what circumstance, like, why are you sitting on the damn fence? Under what circumstances would you sign that contract? And if they'd already flattened the corridor completely, Labor would have been able to say, look, damage is done. The freeway's going ahead, fine, and that gives them the way out. But we were able to hold them to not having any way out, and you've got this incredibly spirited community resistance, and I don't know how it's playing out here because you've got some pretty I should choose my words carefully, but the media environment here is really seriously venomous and hostile, and that's, again, it's not easy in WA, but you're playing in a whole different order here, and don't take any of that shit personally either. We had really friendly media coverage a lot of the time, just saying, government, what are you doing? Like, why are we doing this? And then it became one of the top 3 state election campaigns. And to his credit, the opposition leader, now Premier Mark McGowan, who sold us out on a bunch of other heartbreaking stuff, but to his credit, he didn't do what the Victorian Premier did and spool it out for months. On the very next day after the state election, a thumping win, he said to the contractors, we'll find something else for you to do, but don't come and work on Monday. And we were done.
Yeah.
That end.
Yeah, and that's how you go from one side to the other. And I think that's the thing that is really key that we've been trying to get out, and I know a lot of people have been doing a lot of work on this here, Scott, is the idea of they are doing everything they can to make it look like this is completely done and inevitable. So the amount of the PR spin of those banners that keep going up, and someone might keep writing nice messages on them that may be a different sort of spin, congratulations to whoever is doing that, keep it up. But there are these banners saying WestConnex is here, WestConnex is coming, there's, the tree felling that they're doing, all of the construction that's taking place, when we actually know, and what's going on over there is people can make a submission to what is the draft design process for the tunnel that is supposed to connect and be the connects of WestConnex, that hasn't even been through a full draft design stage yet, and holding up a sign, you should sign them at some point before you go, make a submission. The other bit that I think that we're seeing here is the fact that the whole idea of WestConnex in the first place was to connect to the airport and the port. But those draft designs aren't even released yet. They haven't even got a plan, because when we talk to people, they haven't got the money to fund it. And so we're in this bizarre situation where, as Maureen pointed out, we've got these kind of ever-growing tunnels and tollways coming out of WestConnex, when in actual fact the bit that was supposed to be the connection point is completely missing in action. And yet we've seen whole suburbs, beautiful heritage suburbs, bulldozed, and whole vast bits of land just completely ready as if the construction's about to happen, when in actual fact it's so far off. And that's the real challenge we have. I think I calculated it that on the rate we go through premiers in New South Wales, we'll have another 6 before even on their timeline WestConnex will be complete. So I think the hope is not lost.
Can one of them be you, Maureen, though? Can we just shut this shit down?
Yeah, I'm not sure that's how it works. I don't know.
Not yet.
Anyway.
Not Luke Foley.
Yeah, exactly. Can I get you to talk a bit about, I guess, going into the bigger picture stuff? Because, I mean, I never thought, the things that I think, came to politics in, the things that I came to politics in, I was worried about global human rights issues, I was worried about big international injustices and what was happening locally. I remember still, and I'm happy to confess it to this crowd, at some point thinking, wow, everyone's really talking about this WestConnex thing, I really should go and, find out what's going on with it. And I remember going to a community meeting in St. Peter's, and within about 5 minutes of starting to hear people explain what was going on, I was just completely outraged and sold that I was completely convinced why I should care about stopping this toll road. But I never imagined myself being the person that was most passionate about stopping toll roads, but I realised so quickly from hearing people's stories how much it linked to my sense of how the world should work and how the city that I love should function. I wonder if you can talk a bit about, how you see the connection and the obsession with toll roads to this idea of what makes a city livable. Why should we care about the toll roads so much?
Oh, wow, okay. Was that one on your list?
No, that was just one of them. We said we were going to riff off the list.
No, we are. Well, I think it's a fantastic question, because otherwise your diagnosis ends up wrong. If your diagnosis is, maybe we need to, we need to look at their traffic projections. There's something a bit funny going on there. Then you end up attacking the wrong end of the problem. It feels like it's a really impactful and visceral and very visible symptom of that idea that democratic planning and democratic city building and community building has been occupied and paralysed by private capital for its own benefit rather than the public benefit. And there are any number of 1,000 other examples that you could point to in healthcare or environmental protection or in development policies more broadly. But like, here's a really visceral example, something really harmful and disfiguring is being done to your community and to your city, and the benefit is going to a very, very tiny handful of financial whiz kids and engineering barons, and this really tight little nexus who are also the same ones damaging all kinds of other public goods, public housing, for example. So I feel like that's where it sits for me, and that means, all right, well then let's go after that. And that's why the work that your state and federal colleagues do on anti-corruption and kind of trying to decontaminate politics is so important, because if, Parliament is really brittle, it's very broken in some important ways, but it's one of the most important avenues that we have for collectively directing where public capital goes, where your taxes go. And if its committees get shut down, if its audit processes kind of get demobilised, and if the other instruments of trying to aggregate the collective will are being really deliberately sabotaged, not just with the freeway, but with all sorts of other ways, then you kind of bug it. Yeah. And that's what we see happening here. There's no public benefit here.
Yeah. Just to jump in on that, the thing that's even, you talk about in terms of the level of corruption and challenges we have in New South Wales, the other issue we're seeing with the Sydney Motorway Corporation is it's now a completely private entity. So the government has created a private entity which they're now going to sell off to deliver this toll road, which isn't subject to any of the freedom of information requests, anything else that actually was there. To their credit, the toll inquiry that Maureen sat on got the chair of the CEO of the Sydney Motorway Corporation to appear, but even that was a challenge in itself.
Did you have to subpoena them? How'd you get them there? Almost.
Pushed and shoved.
Pushed and shoved.
But yeah, he really didn't think that he had an obligation to, even though, and this is the challenge we're facing, is the connection between that and then the sense of where's the decisions, who's accountable.
Corporations are not democracies, like they're profoundly anti-democratic entities. Even the nice ones, even the ones doing nice things, they're profoundly anti-democratic. Shit.
You don't have to answer that, we'll take questions later.
Yeah. Don't be so disruptive. Everyone's been so nice so far. A rough fucking week, all right?
Can we, so you go on that,
No,
and then I'm going to go.
That's, you know where I'm heading. Like, corporations are profoundly anti-democratic constructs, and when that worldview and that kind of machinery, that institutional machinery, occupies your democratic spaces, you're in really serious trouble, and that's what's going on here. That's why it needs to be fought.
For sure. So it feels depressing doing this stuff sometimes, and the lanterns last night weren't depressing. The lanterns last night were wonderful and inspiring and uplifting, and it feels like sometimes there's a sense of despair and a lack of hope. And I feel like sometimes we can be cheesy and say we want this livable, sustainable city, But what is that? What does that actually look like for you? Rather than this kind of slogan you put on a postcard occasionally, or I might be known to put on a postcard occasionally. What does a sustainable, good, livable city look like to you? What's the
Is there any chance I could have another beer?
Yeah, totally. Mark, do you mind? Oh, there you go. Thanks, Cole. I don't need another one.
Whatever's on draft.
That's fine.
Thank you. So we did. I did get a little bit of advance warning of this question. So.
Yeah, the beer suggested that I also was throwing random questions, but I was not.
But you were not. So we did a pile of work at home, which is going to be one of the things. Maybe this preempts another question that I want to do in the next couple of months. Is try and finish this up. Which was responding to a question actually that Bob put to us in Party Room years and years ago, which is, what does my street look like in your green future? What does it look like? If the Greens win, what do you get? What does it look like? And I realised I didn't really know. Like, I had some vague ideas, but if I didn't know, how the hell was I going to be able to communicate it to people who might be a bit sceptical? So we did it arse backwards, I think. So don't do it the way that we did it. But we started with transit, or we started with this kind of principle of closed loop economics and closed loop cities. So closed loop economics as opposed to this kind of once through torrent which doubles in material throughput about every 25 years and is the reason that the ocean's full of plastic and that climate change and all that. So you have mass extinction at one end of that and like incredible pollution crisis at the other. And no other part of the biosphere behaves like that. So what if a city behaved like it actually belonged in the biosphere? That was sort of our starting principle, which I know sounds a bit fluffy, but there's some interesting and really simple rules that you can apply to see if a particular piece of your economic structure is behaving like a carcinogen or like a part of a living structure. And so we figured that's fine. I could draw a little diagram of that and figure out what that meant, but what would it look like if a city of 2 million people behaved like that? What does a closed loop city look like? So I'm glad we started with that principle, but then after that we got everything asked backwards. So we started with transit and designed a light rail system, got it costed, and sort of went for an anywhere to anywhere public transport network. There's a guy called Rob Adams who's an urban planner in Melbourne, and his work's come under a bit of criticism, but it's a really interesting idea of how to return the kind of neighbourhood amenity that in a city like places like this, where a lot of things are walkable, within 500 metres of here, and I don't know Petersham that well, you can walk to a lot of stuff. But you go to the outer burbs, you go way out west, and a car is mandatory. A car for every working adult is mandatory, whether you're a greenie or not. And so how do you get that kind of neighbourhood amenity to everybody, rather than just saying, well, this little kind of inner city enclaves deserve that and everybody else just got to drive for miles. So Rob Adams' wonderful idea, and his is based on Melbourne, we applied it to Perth. I don't think it would be super difficult to do it here. The basic layout, lie of the land, and we worked this through with some transport academics who are basically the peacemakers between the greenies and the property council. Is everyone all right with that? Yeah. Just testing the mood of the room, property council.
Did you get that?
Okay, so they brought a bunch of friendly developers into the room, not sprawl type people.
That's also, you just have to understand New South Wales, friendly developers is not something we're used to here, right?
So, but somebody has to build the stuff, right? Somebody's going to have to build it. And so they're like, can you please bring in some people who aren't sprawl merchants and who also aren't into the kind of high-rise apocalypse, who aren't going to want to put a 40-storey tower over somebody's back fence, but like 2-3 stories, somebody still has to design and build that. And that's what works really agreeably with mass transit, like networked mass transit, where frequency is the most important thing. You don't have to check a timetable, maybe you check an app, or maybe you just walk down there and the next one's like 7 minutes away max. And you extend that out along transit arteries and along corridors, and it means taking lanes back off private cars. And then you go up 2 or 3 stories. So you take out all the parks, all the schools, all the heritage areas, anything with neighbourhood amenity, anything that someone writes a petition and says, don't touch that bit, we love it, we live here. Take that out. And what's left is enormous. All the car parks, the parking lots, the stuff that takes up all this space, urban blight, light industrial areas, along these corridors. Rob Adams, his little team said without knocking over a single tree or having to move a school or pollute anybody's neighbourhood, they could fit 2 million more people into Melbourne's existing urban footprint along the tram network by going up 2-3 stories, or in particular hotspots you go up 4 or 5. Yeah, it's like Barcelona density, and you extend that mesh across the whole city. And so all these new dwellings, for us it was 250,000, and we modelled 7 corridors. Everybody living in this new affordable, diverse, low-rise housing is within 50 to 100 metres of mass transit. So we did that bit with the developers and the architects, and then we kind of did a revamp of it with some designers and really brilliant architects who said, also, what if it was beautiful? Like, what if it isn't just concrete tilt-up shit boxes that you're going to have to knock over in 20 years because it's so awful? What if it was designed beautifully, which was the Design Perth project, and that went quite well. And then just to run through it quickly, sorry I'm going on so much, but
no, you're right.
I
Keep
really
talking about
I
this
adore
because
this
it's really
stuff.
good.
So
it's really good for people to hear the good stuff.
It's hard
the
for me to make
stuff.
it stop.
So
Then we had a Copenhagen-style bike network costed, so it's reasonably easy to model. What is 500 metres of painted stuff on the road look like? How much does that cost? What does 500 metres of protected bike lane cost? I know Clover's done some really useful stuff in this town on cycling, so you've got a bit of a jump, but also not just for your pretty inner city areas, like everybody, the whole urban footprint. That was the bike vision plan. Then we got around to the housing and design stuff, and the brilliantly gifted Chantal Caruso wrote us a national housing plan, which Lee is now doing exceptionally wonderful things with, about, well, how much of it's going to be affordable, because one of the things that can happen when you do transit-oriented development is you take a blighted neighbourhood and you throw a light rail stop in there, and immediately it makes it unaffordable for anybody who happened to be living there in rent. So how do you offset that? By design, not as a kind of afterthought or retrofitting it. So that was part of what the housing affordability plan was. At the same time, we had a really, really talented technical team doing a 100% renewable energy plan. So some of these developments can power themselves. In fact, some of them have to, because your underlying infrastructure is not going to be able to cope. Your sewer, your water, your electricity won't be able to cope unless it's closed loop architecture and it's generating its own power, it's recycling a fair bit of its own waste, it's capturing some of its own water, and it's growing some of its own food. Take some of the pressure off 50, 60, 100-year-old services. It means you don't have to move and dig everything up, which makes it a lot cheaper. And then the final, that came with the jobs plan, which wasn't just about the clean energy stuff, but like all of it. And then the final part of it, I've left out a bunch of stuff, was the urban forest plan, which is like, all right, we've just taken all the pressure off greenfields, we can keep market gardens, and we can keep urban bushland. What happens now if we reweave it? And we look at what the biosphere was trying to do before this gigantic concrete thing landed on top of it and started sprawling. What was it trying to do, and can we help it do that with a massive regrowth program? And that's what I mean by getting it asked backwards, because we wrote this urban forest document and looked at it and went, this is really very white fella way of doing stuff. Like the urban corridors, or the urban forest corridors that we were talking about putting back, all have names that are 50,000 years old. You know, these are places that have been sung forever, they're all still there, it's all still there. So the kind of last piece of it was, well, I want to see that map in language. You know, I want to know what the Nyungas called these places, because a lot of the roads following the lie of the land were following tracks that had been laid down before the last ice age, and all of that was there, that these are cultural landscapes, not just for the people who arrived this tiny fragment of time ago, but for people who've been cultivating that country forever. And I wish we'd started with that. It was a blinding afterthought that we looked at, and when we can't publish this, this is really disrespectfully wrong. So if I had my time to do it again, I'd flip it around. I'd start with country, and then we'd work our way back. But we called that the WA 2.0 project, or Perth 2029, or take your pick. Its brand was a bit elusive, but it provided us with a really interesting insight into what a closed loop city, a big industrial closed loop city, would look like. Whew.
That sounds good. This one isn't on my sheet.
Uh-oh.
So that sounds completely like a wonderful way to plan a livable, sustainable city. What do you think are the biggest barriers to why that's not how we see the world working now?
I'm very glad you asked me that, Jenny. The biggest barrier is that you can't do that while we've got this monster sprawling and smashing people's neighbourhoods down and laying concrete everywhere. Like, you really can't. They're deeply incompatible and different kinds of city. What happened in Portland, which is one of our models, and what's happened to a lesser degree in Seattle, but there's probably other better examples, is you have a kind of a point of trauma or crisis, or a community stands up and stops a hideous freeway, or a confrontation that you win. And in Portland, what they did with the money, like with the huge amounts of money that got freed up, cancelling this stupid elevated freeway, was they put in light rail and regenerated an area and built a whole pile of affordable housing. And I feel like that is what we're going to need, and I hope WestConnex is that. It's a point of trauma, and it's a collision between two really different worldviews. And if you win, it will create political space in the backwash to put another vision forward. And one of Christine's favourite expressions was, in a crisis, the first person with a plan on the table wins. Be the ones with that plan on the table. I know, and I'm not come here to lecture you about how to do this stuff, that you're not all here as just oppositional, like you've all got ideas and dreams for your neighbourhoods and your community. Write them down, make some maps, even if it's just first draft. Our kind of tagline was, yes, this is, done by students and interns and volunteers, because the state planning department's doing something really dumb instead. We're sorry that we had to do this. It was the best we could do. Please help us make it better. But you need that alternative vision, because what you've got at the moment, you put the two together, and people will always pick the better one.
I'm going to just say on that, I think one of the things, if people haven't seen it, the City of Sydney put out an alternative plan to using the St Peters interchange site, which is where there's going to be a massive, it's the big, worst sort of LA spaghetti-style tollway site just down at the bottom of Sydney Park, and if you have a look at their alternative plans in terms of what could be delivered there, housing basically, other community infrastructure that we need versus this idea of a polluting toll road, it gives that vision for what could happen in that area while at the same time addressing some of the congestion needs. And I think you see that kind of plan going out there, and you see the complete disregard of the state government to consider it. But even before that, and I know there are people here that have collected tens of thousands of submissions to the environmental impact statement process, and those people will know that actually you can put all those alternatives, you can raise all those concerns, and so often they don't get listened to. But I think one of the big values of the City of Sydney's plan that they've put out is actually the fact that it gives a really clear alternative that links to something that is key in this city, which is the crisis around housing affordability and the insecurity that people are facing around housing. So maybe we'll just take a leap there for a second. You have, in the past, talked a lot about renters' rights around housing affordability. I acknowledge that Lee is in the back there, and I know that her and I will both be doing a lot of work in this space and have been already trying to push things. But I wonder if you can talk a bit more about how you see the housing affordability element of this picture fitting into what is a livable city, and where you think the biggest challenges are for us.
Brilliant. Lee, are you still planning on speaking? Do we still have you?
Yeah, we can. Lovely.
Good. I think
cool.
You still should. That's my hint that I'm dropping.
We'll create a space.
So my take on it, having handed that formal portfolio on a year or so ago, my take on it is we did this kind of analysis where we looked at the underlying idea that the housing market is a market, and markets can be really anti-democratic and profoundly, create inequality. And if you set your market up designed to create inequality, which is what our housing market is, you get shattering housing unaffordability because the thing is designed to inflate property prices. It's got all these tax levers that are deliberately, systematically inflating property prices so that you get a capital return. And that's a really hideous thing to do. And I can remember seeing, I wish I'd kept it. It was really dumb not to keep it. It was the Australian newspaper, which I don't read anymore, but at the time I was reading it. And on the one hand, there was this really savage report on homelessness, and on the other page, literally the opposite page, there was a celebratory article, probably ghostwritten by the real estate sector, about how investors had got like 12% capital growth in that year. And it's like, nobody has joined the dots between these two things. This is the same story, and we're celebrating it on this side, and we're going, oh, and we're kind of wringing our hands about that. So, sorry, long-winded. Shit, I really lost my talent for just giving simple answers, which I never had. So we attacked it from two ends, and Lee's doing exceptional stuff on this, and if somebody in the audience doesn't ask her about it, I'm going to, is to widen the space of third sector housing and reminding ourselves that housing is a human right. It's not just another asset class. You've basically got an entire generation of people who are going to be renting for life. I will almost certainly be one of them. And that shouldn't be a second-class kind of tenure. In other countries, they've figured out how to make that really stable tenure. You're not in hock to the banks for $400,000, $500,000, $600,000, or what's the median house price here is now over $1 million. It's mental. That's so wrong. Yeah, right. And particularly where we're sitting here, is that you shouldn't have your life impacted if you end up being a lifelong renter. And so that means opening up that third sector housing. Social housing has just been screwed. Public housing has been screwed, and community and affordable housing has also kind of hit some pretty heavy weather. So we had, at both ends of the spectrum, we're going to fix the tax system, we're going to knock off negative gearing, capital gains tax exemptions, other things that are just hopelessly expensive, like stamp duties, replace that with a really broad-based land tax, which is that idea is as old as Federation or older. And on the other hand, we're going to use all that capital that we free up to do a social housing boom. And it's not just going to be concrete boxes 50 k's over the horizon. We're going to do it along these transit arteries, and we're going to make it beautiful. It's going to be green, it's going to power itself, it's going to be affordable and diverse. So you kind of remove some of the structural stuff at the same time as you're saying we're in a hideous supply crisis. We've got to build stuff, and the market is failing. The market has been designed to fail unless you're, a Liberal politician with a big property portfolio, in which case it's working quite well.
Yeah, and when you look at how many of the federal parliamentarians have multiple investment properties, it starts to, the idea of vested interest really takes on a whole new meaning. But I think one of the things, and just to put a plug in there for the challenge that we face in New South Wales and also the opportunity that looks to us now, is the fact that they're reforming the rental laws this year. There's going to be changes to the Residential Tenancies Act. We're pushing really hard to see an end to no grounds evictions. In New South Wales, people can just be kicked out because they make one too many maintenance requests, or the landlord, being dodgy, wants to put up the rent more than what they'd get away with, and so they kick someone out and then put it back on the market. That's a really important thing that we're pushing in New South Wales Parliament, to be able to make those changes. But I agree it'd be great to bring Lee into that conversation as well. Scott, before I open it up to ask if other people have questions that they want to put in the mix, I wonder if you can talk a bit about where you see the community's role. And I think you mentioned it in passing in terms of this being collective actions, where a strong community actually is behind this, that we as the Greens don't own it. There's actually a lot of leadership coming from the community. I wonder if you've got any moments that you can think of around, whether it be the Perth Rethink the Link campaign in Perth or other things that you've been involved in, that are moments of inspiring community action, moments of people coming together, that actually gives a strong sense of, you know, this is how we change the world.
How we win. Yeah, there were so many moments like that. It's actually a bit hard to go through them, but the one that really jumped as you were putting that to me was when we went out of our comfort zone. And Labor can take a little bit of credit for this, actually. I'm not going to name names, but it wasn't my idea, but it was a really good idea. Was I don't know whether any of you have been to Perth or have a rough idea of the geography, but we collectively had assembled a rough working plan for why we didn't need this toll road and what we would do with freight instead. It was a really interesting plan. I hope it actually gets done now, but basically involved putting a hell of a lot more containers on rail and moving them to a much more suitable area than trying to just slam everything into the Port of Fremantle, which is, well, it's going to be over capacity before too long, if you've just got this continual kind of growth that they anticipate. And what it meant was we ended up in alliance with the Kwinana Industries Council and with a bunch of crew who we normally wouldn't have got out of our little inner city enclave to go talk to. And they were super supportive. They wanted the jobs, they wanted the industry, they recognised and did a ton of heavy lifting on the planning process. And it meant we were kind of linking arms with people that were not traditional allies for greenie groups fighting heritage campaigns in the inner city. And that was one of my favourite days on the campaign, because we just had a really interesting mashup of different interests. And I hadn't had, to be really honest, as a Greens anti-nuclear campaigner, I hadn't had a huge amount to do with the Kwinana Industries Council. They were way over my horizon and not really on our radar. And then they came forward with this brilliant stuff that was like, yes, this is what we do instead. This is great. And we went down there, we got out of Fremantle, we got out of Bibra Lake. So, and I know, you know, it was one of the things that some of the campaigners, when we did this thing in April up here, were saying the physical impact area and imprint of all these connected things is so gigantic that it's actually really kind of difficult. It's just a huge spatial extent. But anything that we can do to make links with people that we wouldn't necessarily have met otherwise, out west, who are facing really different economic and social and heritage concerns and environmental concerns to what we got, and are being told that it's kind of this or nothing. You're never going to get a train, but you can have this 8-lane traffic jam that demolishes your house. Anything that we can do to link arms with people outside places like this, I think, is always going to be worthwhile.
I think the key for that is you look at the size difference, and I think that's important to remember. You're talking, I think the railway projects, you're talking 5 kilometres, I think.
The really hideous bit was 5, but yeah.
So we're talking in terms of WestConnex, 33 kilometres just for the WestConnex bit, and now we're seeing, and almost, I mean, Maureen described some of the now sort of, what do you call them, toxic tentacles? The toxic tentacles that are appearing out of that take it to a whole new level. I think that in a way, the fact that it's now extending so broad means that actually it's becoming a whole of metropolitan Sydney and beyond problem, which in a sense makes it easier for those campaigns to connect because of those because of those common interests around pollution stacks, air pollution, toll roads, whatever it is. And I think that gives us an opportunity, whereas before that, the 33-kilometre route is actually quite a challenge in terms of the communities it's going through, who goes where, people worried about their own sort of area, which is completely understandable. So I think now we're seeing a focus on the sort of toxic nature of it on a much larger scale, which is actually allowing for more communities. I keep talking about the lanterns last night, but it was really beautiful.
It does look like it was pretty lovely.
But
it's one of those things that's actually really hard to do because people are stretched and fried, and I know people in here have been at this for years, and it's such unyielding work. But yeah, it's worth it. There'll be people who are who want to be part of this campaign and whose interests are directly affected. They just don't know it yet. You know, they want to be in this room or in a hall out west. They just don't know it yet. But it's our job to find the others.
And it is the other thing just to mention that is another connection point, which I think is a you know, if I always take the optimistic view of something, the fact that state government has announced they want to privatise our inner west bus routes and bus service
Privatising.
means that they love that.
Do they run it down and make it really
They love
shit
that.
and then
Yeah,
say,
they
oh,
love
the
that.
solution is to sell it?
Hilariously, if it wasn't so concerning, apparently it's because there's so many complaints made, but actually when you look into the detail of what the complaints were, it's because the congestion is so bad that the buses don't do where they want to, not because actually they have an issue with the public bus service. Anyway, that's another thing.
Coming and going, haven't they?
But I think that the important thing there, and I know that Chris Kell, who is here, there's been a great connection between the No WestConnex public transport folks being at the Sydney bus privatisation, the risk around the Inner West Buses campaign, and that connection there and seeing that link is actually another really powerful connection between different communities of interest that are now coming together, which is always a good thing to see.
Yeah, it's perfect. Can I plug that book one last time?
Do it.
Maybe you don't have time to read. Hope in the Dark. It's a really, really beautiful read by someone who's a lifelong activist, who writes beautifully, who's been on the front line on stuff, seen campaigns won, seen them lost, seen them forgotten. It's really worth it. If you're having a hard time or if you just want to rest, have a read. It's beautiful.
Great.
Rebecca Solnit.